Dobry wieczór, witam Państwa.
Good evening. Welcome to the next day of our Jacek Kuroń Festival. This year, the title is well seen on the leaflets and the posters. I need to do important things that go beyond myself and my life. Without such actions, I would be bored to death. That's the motto. About the media. Invited guests from Poland and abroad to work with a couple of them each other, and each one of them, if they are important thing that we had. So welcome to Sakalis, Collegium. My name is Agnieszka Wiśniewska, and I am the chief of the Krytyka Polityczna portal. I need to do important things, and one of these things is to create the media, to be in the media. And the debate tonight is titled the same way that you might associate with a song. The revolution will not be televised. And remember that on the about the media is the also know from of Krytyka. I hope it's not our last issue, but it's our latest issue. The end of press, you will be missing it. And this is a tale about the fact that the media have changed. We buy fewer papers. The internet is here to stay. It seemed that it was going to be a promise of a new space for a media debate. And that it was going to be a place that would give a voice to everyone who have so far not been able to be heard on traditional media. And I think that's a deception, because it has been commercialized to a very big extent, so you can count the entries on the internet. Money has been driven away from the press. It's there on the internet, but it's dependent on the number of clicks. So in one of the latest books by a Polish author, the protagonist works for an internet website, and he has a scoreboard where he sees which articles get the biggest number of clicks. If something doesn't get enough clicks, it needs to have its title changed and needs to be a catchy one. And this is more or less what the media market looks like these days. And what I'd like to ask you at the beginning was what your experiences are, what media you originate from. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with openDemocracy, so Alex, I want you to tell us a few words about openDemocracy and your experience with working with the media, electronic media, paper, traditional media, what the media are like today, what they expect from you as editors and authors.
Can everyone hear? Okay. My name is Alex Sakalis. I'm an editor at openDemocracy.net. We are a platform for debate and analysis based in London. We started in 2001, before most people had any idea of taking news media essentially online. And this was before mainstream newspapers went online. This is before, online was anything other than essentially, Amazon and porn. So we started off, and our idea was essentially we wanted to utilize the new medium of internet to promote debate and analysis. And we thought that the internet was a very democratic and symmetrical way to do it. It didn't require the grand sort of networks and the grand sort of, movements within the mainstream press media. And our idea was essentially to publish maybe one article every few days, then like a response, and then to have them side by side. And every week or so, we would produce maybe a printed edition, because back then we thought, why not? 2 months later, 9/11 happened. And this changed everything. And before long, we were getting so many commentary pieces, analysis, and debate that we had to publish them all. This was a time of sort of great discussion and energy and, you know, optimism and pessimism all at once, and people didn't really know what was going on. So we stopped publishing with print, and we kept going on online. At the time, it was very, very easy to get money because the internet was a very new thing. Lots of kind of angel investors, philanthropists, venture capitalists were willing to put a lot of money into something that was online, because that was seen as the future. So we had a lot of money at the time. A few years down the line, they came here to make what we do, and we've grown exponentially since then. At the moment, we have several sections based around the world. We have sections which are in Europe, which is based in London, our UK section based in Edinburgh, our Democracy Abierta section, which is to do with Spanish and Latin American media, which is based in Barcelona. We have a Russian section, which is based predominantly in Berlin. And average now, and we're getting people who are interested in debate and a platform for that, and a kind of commons and submit articles. We more people, academic, to journalists, ordinary people say, because of course their opinion is just as valuable as anyone else. That's where we are today. At the moment, our main concerns to avoid perspective from European perspective that involves TTIP, which is one of our main kind of issues. The other one is the upcoming Brexit debate. We're trying to create a space for people to debate this rationally, because framed in the mainstream media now, the referendum is based on essentially immigrants or expecting you to in 3 weeks. Democratize, you know, need, European object, outside of the mainstream European Union kind of hegemony. And those essentially are our main concerns. And we're especially interested in, for example, the DM25 movement by Yanis Varoufakis to try and democratize Europe. We're also interested in the rise of populism, both to the left and the right, and getting these people to come and give their opinions. And we're also interested in essentially providing a platform for people to come and debate issues in a non-partisan way. We don't have an editorial line because all lines should be contested. So that's our space. And at the moment, we have filled that kind of niche.
Who is? Can you hear us? Who is your audience? Who reads you? Have you got any feedback from them? Do you know? Are you aware who reads openDemocracy? A typical reader.
We send out people to fill in, and in those surveys, most of our audience are sort of people, media, people, journalism, people in the UK, and themselves even politically engaged. Quite a niche audience at the moment. I mean, it's something we really want to try and diversify a bit, but as it stands, that's the kind of people that reads us at the moment.
Annabelle, I'd like to ask you, you work mainly as a freelancer, and in Poland, but not just in Poland. So what does the work look like? I don't know how you started your work. When you started you were freelance to begin with, or did you just find yourself in a market where there is no full-time jobs? And what is the everyday work of a person who makes a living in journalism, is related to journalism, but is not fully tied with any paper? I think it's perhaps even more interesting not to be tied with anyone. Half Polish and half British. When I had a lot of free time at college in here to Poland, writing first for and supported about the East Europe. And when I was here, more and more, I more into the mainstream media, and like I'm in London, Europe, and also a more of a lifestyle that is in London. I work right for as well, so not very predictable. And it's very, and you don't do the same. I some possible to spend your whole life on for many in fact, as a journalist, editor-in-chief, anchor on the radio, etc. Full-time, not with a contract, as a volunteer, without a contract. Would you this change work media? You meet different ways than you did 10. Me that it is changed. Sure. Journalists, but degree they are on today in Poland are in fact a very precarious occupation. In fact, most of the radical majority of the people who work for the media, I would say about 80% or even more of the people work on a freelance basis, fragmented basis, but it's quite common for large mainstream media to take on, or perhaps to take advantage of, people who are very young, mostly students, to do the job. And squeezing the lemon, so they squeeze as long as it is possible and it gives juice, but then they take a new one. And that is the type of uncertainty that rarely really translates into a direct order: write about this, don't write about that, like don't write about TTIP because it's not interesting. This level of makes journalism for such intelligent look what the boss wants, and them to learn. At that point, we see in the message spoke about area stream, not because it's just not there. Not to those who basically should have more knowledge in terms of editing, just refuse to cover some issues, and this is where the message is created. For a number of years, really, I've been a freelancer myself, so if it's possible, I will do something and cover it, sometimes not. I've been unlucky enough to be editor-in-chief of the Przekrój Weekly twice, But my biggest misfortune, the biggest misfortune that you could experience, that after you've stopped being editor-in-chief, you can't find a job at all because nobody wants you. But during my second time in 2012, when we did the left-wing version of the Przekrój Weekly, I had this feeling that we were doing something really cool, but that we were functioning in a slightly different way. Even the capitalists who came up with this idea that they wanted to do a left-wing, they for half a year, and as an anarchist operation, we took the tool and we did our job without looking back. And apart from all the promises that were made, how he was going to invest and how he was going to help us and how he was going to launch a campaign and change the graphics and take care of the distribution, well, none of this was kept. Only one, perhaps, and we needed to fight over it, that he was going to stay away from what we were writing, and we were able to write autonomously whatever we wanted, and that was, I think, quite important. I did that twice. Like I said, in Przekrój, I was editor-in-chief 10 years before, and that also shows what's happening in the media. In 2002, when I was the editor-in-chief for a couple of months, our the oldest national weekly that had been published since 1945, the team was composed of about 40 people, all of the members of staff, without, of course, the printing auxiliaries, but the journalists, editors, graphic designers, etc. And in 2012, our team were 6 people. So, and we ran a nationwide magazine that was published for a while, and we had to do that and had several thousand copies. Because most were women, perhaps. In fact, all of us were women. So they know how to sacrifice. Astor Taylor, in the latest issue, quotes some statistics concerning Wall Street Journal in 2010. Apart from materials published just online, in the first semester of 2010, produced as many articles, 21,000, as they had over the whole year a decade earlier. So the same number over one semester as they had, whereas the employment rate dropped by 13%. So it looks similar. So fewer people that have to do more work, and the more work has to be a race.
Trochę jest tak, że jedna...
Well, we probably know what it looks like, and after the sort of ritual of complaining about things going wrong, less money, less audiences, and people read less. The market is going very commercial, but in Poland we have this political charge. We have the government media, we have the opposition media, and they convey the message of one or the other party. Now, in all that, we're probably interested in doing something else as journalists. So what I'm intrigued by is, what I'm wondering about is about the opportunities. What opportunities do you see? I asked Alex, who reads openDemocracy? Who is the audience? Who is the target of super quality journalism, analytical, in-depth, thorough, that can be read by hardly anyone today? I've been the editor-in-chief of the portal since January, and since January we have been discussing whether long or short form being the new black. Short form is below the 20,000 characters, and someone sent a link to the analysis that proves that if a text is long and interesting, people will read it anyway, because recently in the Newsweek portal, there was a text with 8,000 characters and people still read it. 8,000 characters. It's probably 3 passages, 3 paragraphs of one of the writers. Well, that's the sort of magazine we publish. It's a book, really. So in a sense, we know it's not a message for the masses, for massive audiences, mass audiences really. On the other hand, we know that we want to fill in the white spots. So what opportunities are there, Alex? You said that you can actually do things through NGOs. That's the place you can actually go to, and where you can get the money where. So who can actually be the partner for a journalist, for an in-depth journalist? Is there anyone who needs it in the first place? Are there any people out there who want to be in-depth journalists? Now, you teach journalists, Romek, and you meet would-be journalists. You told me what these people are before we entered. So I'm hoping that you will repeat it here. It's kind of sad. So with that, my question is, let's leave those cliques and the mainstream media. Who is it worth doing for, and who is it worth doing with? I'm talking about the type of journalism that we do in Open Democracy, or the sort of texts that Annabelle writes. So are you writing for a small handful of savvy readers who read The Economist and the like, and week in, week out you have to find the title that will buy your text? So you have to shop for business, if you like, every week. So is there a place for you? Is there a place for the sort of journalism that fills the white spots and is, quality journalism? As a matter of fact, I write for the mainstream media. So for us, the question is, how do you actually survive in the market full of, volatility and precariousness? So it's really also related to clickability. If I want to write a long text, I would probably approach Open Democracy. Do you have a dilemma? Do you have these dilemmas? This will not be taken by The Economist. This is more for Open Democracy. Well, that's what happens sometimes in commercial texts, which are very short. You can't always find enough room to say what you want. It's sometimes 600 words. I'm not sure about characters, but it's basically 1 page. But having said that, it's a very good thing. It teaches us journalists to write concise texts that are actually read by people. But also there are long forms, and I know that The Guardian has succeeded with its small initiative in the UK, the long read it's called, and they publish a very long text every day, long for British standards, 5,000 words, I mean. Alex? You kind of talked about the audience, but when you produce your Open Democracy, you want to fill the white spots, take up the sort of topics that mainstream does not touch. So you do it, but you think you're doing this because the audience, the academic, more savvy reader, is the type of person who will do what with this knowledge? Why do you want to target this particular reader? Are you thinking about these things when you are editing an issue? So do you think who you're reaching out to and why and what for?
Well, we describe ourselves on our website as a commons. Our idea is to challenge the general passivity of the reader, the idea that the reader, consumes what is written for them, the idea that journalism is performed essentially by sort of bourgeois liberal people, and then the reader consumes them, and it's passivity. We want an active readership. We want people to come to our site and choose what to read. We don't want to tell them what to read. We want people to have a wide range of debates to choose from on both sides. We don't want to pursue a single editorial line. At the moment, we are limited in a number of ways. One of them is, firstly, that we publish in English. And if we want to reach a European audience, and I really want to because we publish a lot on Europe, I edit the Europe section, if we only write in English, we'll probably only reach an audience of people who, Europeans who are, have a certain kind of type to them. They're sort of educated, they're Erasmus-y, they perhaps are sort of gearing themselves up for a job in NGOs and stuff like that. I mean, if we really want to reach, other people, I mean, that's an issue. I mean, English is the global language, but it's firstly an issue to reach like people in Europe who are not educated to read English, essentially. The second issue is that we're very interested in social movements across Europe. The social movements which arise in Spain, in Greece, in Italy, in the UK, in Ireland. We want to get them talking to each other. We want them to provide a platform for them to speak to each other, to exchange ideas, to essentially to get their message out, but also disseminate it in a way that is active, so people can look at that and say, I agree with that, I'm going to do this, I disagree with that. It's not something we've reached yet, because actually social movements in Europe at the moment, not so many are really talking to each other. They're still sort of stuck in their own kind of specific national context. But there is, I think, fertile ground there. A few weeks ago, actually, we attended in Berlin, Agnes was there representing Krytyka Polityczna, a sort of gathering of independent media from out Europe. We had comrades of ours from, for example, El Diario in Spain, from Novara Media in the UK. We had groups there from Greece, from Austria, from Germany, from France. And it was incredible. We're all doing fantastic things in our countries, but we've never really spoken to each other and said, what are you doing in your country? How can we learn from you? What can you learn from us? How can we collaborate? And it doesn't really occur to us sometimes. We haven't really reached that kind of transnational level, I think, yet, in social movements and in transnational media. I think that's the next step we want to reach. We want to reach out beyond the kind of niche academic, the niche sort of highly educated Erasmus-y people. We want to really have social movements, active readership, people saying what they want to read, and eventually, people, paying for that as well, because the current market models are simply unsustainable.
Wyobrażasz sobie...
Can you imagine openDemocracy being turned into a paid service which is actually read by people? Do you think it is sustainable? Well, I agree that, well, probably both you and I, we know similar people in international, independent online media. We've been to such meetings 100 times where you have to do a lot of networking in order to create a transnational platform, in order to take this transnational platform to be used as a vehicle for transnational content, for transnational audiences. No one has ever seen a transnational audiences apart from the Erasmus-y people. So you can actually go on building the platforms and have your exclusive content thrown onto the platforms. But interestingly enough, you're right in saying that these platforms, a lot of them are so inward looking. They are interested in the social movements that broke out in whatever, Spain, Italy, Greece, you're turned on by this and we want to be there. But I'm struck by this disconnect. These people meet, speak English, read English and the national languages, but the platform they're creating must obviously be in English because, you know, that's the language, that's the lingua franca. So I'm just thinking, can we create, well, we can always create this elitist circle, but what difference can we make having this exclusive, small, narrow circle? I think we can actually talk about what we do more often. We do the political critique as well. We have editors from Poland, Czech Republic, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary. The Ukrainian team has joined us. And we're writing for the international audiences. Just for people to understand what's going on in Poland and what's going on in the region, because I think that's something that and probably you could notice that in Berlin when the transnational group meets and they are supposed to do the transnational platform. Europe always ends on the Schengen zone. The East is kind of non-existent. Belarus, Moldova, they don't exist. So. You know, being Krytyka Polityczna, here we're just thinking why we all need to create niche online media. Well, maybe because we can do this to show that there is a region in Europe. It has its own narrative. It has its own voice. You mentioned that openDemocracy was interested in the M25 movement initiated by Yanis Varoufakis, and he'll be here in. When you look at the DM manifesto, it's a manifesto about the Eurozone, and there's no East at all in this manifesto. So our friends from Ukraine said we wouldn't sign it because we don't exist there. Well, I'm saying all this because when we put the mainstream media aside, when we create media with a difference for a different audience, what I'm thinking, why? I know why I do the media here in Poland or in the region. Why? Because I want to demonstrate that this region exists and it has its own inherent position to speak up. I'm just wondering whether it's possible to create media both international but also sensitive to the locality, sensitive to the local voices. And is there any are there any audiences out there apart from the Erasmus people who know it? And I don't think we need another platform. Maybe we don't need it because the Erasmus audience is the sort of audience that read English anyway. And that's another thing that is. And I would like to ask Romek. I create media in Polish, and I face these questions. When something was published in openDemocracy in English, is it worth translating into Polish and publishing? Well, my audience is the Erasmus generation, and they've all read it. So why do I have to produce anything else if my audience is this exclusive international type anyway? So I'm wondering what you think about this. You're here, you work here. Do you think that what you do here is kind of interlinked with the international? And about your students, are they the Erasmus generation? My students tend to be quite diverse, and one of them is in the room, so I have to be very cautious. I have two groups of students. One are Polish students, and a growing number of students from Ukraine over the past several years, mainly from Ukraine, but they did come from other countries of the former Soviet Union. And these two groups differ. I prefer working with students from Ukraine because Polish students come to the journalism courses, and by the way, this is a very unique concept of an academic course, because it's really it's about craft, or it's about learning the trade. I teach at a private university, which actually does a lot of trade teaching. So Polish students come with very clear ideas. Girls want to be fashion journalists. Men, on the other hand, most of them come and say they want to be sports journalists, and they want to deal with soccer or football. I then don't really know what I can tell them. When I start working on texts with them, when I manage to persuade them to read books, reportage, and when I tell them and show them how you write text, how you build your credibility, they will have had their own journalism experience as well. But Roman, you're talking about something else, that what we do in television. Why are you teaching us something completely different? Why credible checking, cross-checking, sources? Why? Why 2 or 3 sides to the dispute should be covered? Why? Well, I tell them, I teach you this so that you know that things can be different than in whatever place you are at the moment where you make money. I want you to know that journalism is possible, and I'm still hoping that this type of knowledge will be handy for you. And I will not complain about students. Well, that could be a ritual that has lasted for several thousand years, sorry. But instead, I'll tell you what I learned. Several years ago, when I asked students what weeklies they had read, they read Polish weeklies. There were several weekly magazines that you could actually read, and it turned out that most of them read a radically right-wing magazine. I asked them why. They said they read one magazine, Uważam, że, that doesn't exist, and I'm wondering why, and they look at me as an idiot that I don't know. Why don't you know? It's the cheapest one. So we're talking about content, message, delivery, and it didn't play any role at all. And they couldn't actually, make it out. Name things, call a spade a spade. This is a right-wing magazine, this is the choice I'm making, that's the consequence, what is what, etc. That was kind of surprising and kind of hard. The other experience, a more recent one, I often have the impression that the failure of quality media in Poland, well, quality media still exists, but this failure has ended with an escape of journalists into book writing. Journalists write excellent reportage journalism books, and that's the format they prefer, because newspapers wouldn't buy it, wouldn't pay for it, wouldn't squeeze it in. So the story I'm trying to tell you is that 2 students, he and she, they were reading a book, The 13th Floor by Philip Springer, that talks about the housing situation of Poles 90 years ago, when Poland regained independence in what we call the Second Republic, and then time leap after 89. It's a hair-raising read at an eye-opener about what Polish people live in or lived in, very substandard. Anyway, but that's not the topic I want to talk about. They found the topic interesting or compelling, but they told me about how they read books. They read the book without leaving the monitor of the computer, and they look up everything they read because they couldn't believe what they read. A complete distrust in the author's truthfulness. You know, you don't take it for granted what you read. You have to look it up. 2 or 3 links, and there you go. He's right. He's right. That's the facts. So we tend to live in the world, and by the way, we're talking about the digital revolution, about the online, and about the network or social network message, etc. But that's the generation that has no guides. No direction, and the network is a conglomerate of chaotic multi-vector content messages, and really journalists learn ways of checking the credibility and truthfulness of whatever content they are confronted with.
It's not true that the formerly reliable media did not create the undescript space, that they didn't exclude many topics from their mainstream activity. But today the chaos is incredibly more widespread, and the question remains whether there is a way out of it. And I think that the hunger for leadership is still there. If someone raises the flag and says, I've got something to say and I will lead you, then readers will follow. But this may be very dangerous sometimes. Why dangerous? Because they are following and going towards a dangerous way, and they don't check that. They trust, but they don't check anymore. And the whole right-wing anti-immigrant revolution in Europe is that exactly that. They say that they know what the truth is, and they know who's guilty of the fact that flats in Poland are too expensive or not accessible, why their contracts are trash, and that's the conviction that they have, and it's the conversation that we have about the phenomenon of Paweł Kukiz, who is now a politician, but he has no political message apart from the fact that he doesn't trust politicians, and that's the end of the message. And the only political thought that he had was to introduce the first past the post mandates and election system, and that was completely pointless in Poland, and that was the only political agenda that he had. I wanted to ask you what your media experiences are, whether you have questions, the audience, whether you would like to interfere.
In English, you were talking about Ukrainian students and the Ukrainian media sphere, sort of. And I have a question to Annabelle, because you were working previously in Kyiv Post in Ukraine as well. Yeah, so the question, what is actually the difference between the quality, let's say, of the media in the East and in the West? And how much, and how big is the influence of the private sector and private investment, actually, that manipulates the content sometimes? Because in the East, in Ukraine, like 80% of our media resources are actually financed from the private pocket, from some oligarchs. And that's a huge problem because, you know, we cannot sustain truly democratic and independent media source. And the second question will be actually connected to the general topic of today's debate, basically. Is it possible to have the media source which is absolutely neutral from the ideological perspective. It's not right-wing, it's not left-wing. I mean, it's sort of utopian thing, but still, is it possible? And what is the role of the journalists in this? Is it their personal decision, or they're just trying to reach certain groups within the society? Thanks.
Well, thanks for your question. I was at the Kiev Post almost, I think, 4 years ago for a brief time, and that's not sort of stereotypical Ukrainian media, of course, because it's in the English language and so on. But I think that what you're saying is absolutely right about the role of business in Ukrainian media, and this has been, visible over the past few years since the Maidan, with the sort of economic changes as well, but also the backlash perhaps against business and corruption and so on. And I would say that what these past few years have really brought out in Ukraine is the sort of really brave, hard-working journalists who are trying to counter this. Some really excellent people, for example, the ones involved in this Hromadzkie television and so on. And I think that's something interesting to discuss on this panel as well, because it also came out as a civic initiative during the Maidan and has been trying to now sustain itself to become a more professional media organization. On the neutral media?
To ja krótko. Ja myślę, że to jest...
Briefly, I think it's utopic. It's impossible to achieve, but the utopia of neutral media seems very false to me, because there's a problem that all of a sudden journalists are completely withdrawn from the world of human culture, intellectual culture, and they can then become independent observers. Philosophers have confronted this paradox as whether or not we can be independent observers that are not biased by their own biography, their own gender, their own political views, and they have done away with it. And whereas journalists still seem to be perceived from that mythical perspective. Now the question remains whether, when you are a medium that has its ideological, specified, declared character, can I be an honest medium? And I think that's the fundamental question. Is it honest to say from what political perspective, more or less, I am speaking? I think that is the honest thing to do, rather than saying I am being objective. In Poland, this is what media looked like for several years. They said we are objective, or we are more objective, but it was all untrue. And it pushed huge areas of interest beyond the margin, beyond the possible sphere of reaction. I don't think that's the ideal picture of media. I think what's fair is that we know who's talking to us. We know because their position is determined, and they say, this is how I understand it, but that doesn't mean that I won't give the floor to those who want to strike a polemic, those who are my adversaries, those who I disagree with. This is a fair thing to do, because there is no person who has no political views, even if they're not aware of that. They still make certain choices, or they are in certain places, and they speak from certain social perspectives, from material perspectives, from cultural perspectives, and they have realistic, tangible choices and achievements that they might not be aware of, but these obviously have impact on who they notice, what problems they perceive, and which problems they overlook, and which problems seem completely irrelevant to them.
Just a point on neutrality. In the UK, we have the BBC. The BBC is a state broadcaster, and by law and by remit, it's meant to be neutral. But, what exactly, what is neutrality? Neutrality is, having a scientist debate with a climate change skeptic. That is, essentially one idea of neutrality. It creates a false level of equivalence between two arguments, and, this gives it doesn't create a debate, nor does it actually, it's not neutral, because it's not neutral to have someone who is a climate change skeptic, which is a position supported by like 3% of scientists, versus someone who is an actual scientist. And this strive towards neutrality is, I think, giving people a false perception of firstly, of binarity and of other things like that. Another case, for example, when Jeremy Corbyn was elected last year, the BBC insisted for a long time in referring to him as the far-left leader of the Labour Party. But it never referred to David Cameron as the far-right leader of the Conservative Party. But, you know, I mean, there's no reason why Jeremy Corbyn can be far-left and David Cameron can't be far-right. You know, everything you write and every word you choose, everything you choose, every news story you choose to publish, every news story you choose to withhold is a political act. And the idea of striving towards neutrality, you know, it's false. I mean, neutrality doesn't exist, and we should never strive towards it because it will ruin political debates and it will create people in a false sense of security about the news they receive.
I mean, it's not possible, but the question is how not to cross this borderline between manipulation of the general public and giving them actually the news, the source. You know, because if you will look at the Russian media, they say they're not manipulating anyone, they just give their own opinion, which is, you know, more right-wing, which is true. I mean, they think so. This is the thing that people want. So when is this borderline when you become not a journalist, but the manipulator of the general masses?
Briefly, I'll take the example of the Polish public media that are non-existent right now. Television and the radio, because we've forgotten that there's also the press, that they can be public. And three notions, really. The law that is still there introduces the notion of public media, but as a matter of fact, for over 2 decades after 1989, there was state media. What does that mean? That means that the decision makers on public television and public radio were people that were, to a certain extent, selected from a certain political setup. And in one way or another, this translated to the broadcast, the form of the broadcast, in terms of the news and the commentary. So we had a sort of a state television that is thought by many to be a thing of the past. Nowadays, to a larger extent, and it's going to intensify, we have partisan media, which is an even worse form. But in truth, the BBC example that you quoted is quite important for me. Public media, the public media being independent from the current party in power that try, from many perspectives, describe the reality and the politicians from the point of view of something which is important for the society, is a sort of a model that I would go towards. I wouldn't go and try and achieve the perfect state of a neutral medium, but a public media. A public media should be a certain right that the citizens should be able to enjoy, to hear the description of the world, the reports of events that is not related to interests of a certain party or the ruling party, because the interest of the society is more important and more long-lasting and more significant from our point of view than the interest of any party, whether it's the best or the worst or any possible party imaginable. And this is the sort of media that we should go towards. And the question is why for over 2 decades in Poland that has not happened. And every following government wanted to have their own media. They wanted to give out the several dozen jobs and have some influence that sometimes translated into specific decisions. And those media were not created. And the number of attempts, society-driven actions leading to that change never succeeded. No team, whatever the mandate was, stronger or less strong, each team moved media aside and just wanted to get the piece of the cake for themselves, and that's quite dramatic. I think that only public media can really set a standard of reliability and credibility of the journalists. Other media may perhaps try and catch up with them, better or worse. But the public media should be a right that citizens should enjoy. We have a right, apart from many other, like not to be arrested without any grounds, not to have tabs on your phones, not to be robbed at work. You have also, as a citizen, a right to receive a reliable report from what's happening in the world that would help you to make political choices. But the authorities are not interested in that. They are not interested in us having full knowledge and in us being able to make political choices, and that's the essence of the problem. A question here. A question to... I've not been watching the public media for years, but perhaps if there were so much pro-government, then perhaps the former ruling party would not have lost the election, the Civic Platform. Another question, you said that you were wondering why the populist movement is growing in force. Do you have any conclusions? Shortly, the Civic Platform lost because of the media they had. They failed to notice realistic problems that made law and justice take over the votes. I think that's essentially the problem. The media were cut to the general interest of the ruling party, therefore excluding certain social groups, and a lot of social problems never existed in the media tale. And that is a generality, but this is more or less what it looked like. And also the management style of the media was always a compromise. There was always a setup of political forces. All the previous governments were coalition governments, and the television was a picture of a certain point in the political agenda or of a political composition. So all the previous governments, not just the Civic Platform, but the previous ones, all of them, bear the sin of killing public media in Poland, in fact, unfortunately.
Your question as to why populist parties were on the rise? Well, I think it has to do with two things. Firstly, it's to do with social democratic parties essentially selling their soul to neoliberalism in the 90s. And they stopped saying what they were saying in the 1980s. And if you listen to what the populist parties on the right in France, in Austria, in Germany are saying today, they're saying the exact same things that social democratic parties were saying in the 1980s. They're criticizing globalization. They're criticizing outsourcing. They're criticizing many aspects of capitalism. They're promoting protectionism. And this is something which appeals strongly to workers who got left out of globalization, who have not reaped the benefits of it. And it's true they haven't. Globalization has mainly helped the rich. So the fact that they've managed to kind of take this social democratic philosophy and ideology that social democratic parties have now abandoned is one reason they're so successful. The other is they are appealing to people's sense of identity in an increasingly transnational and globalized world where people feel that their identity is under threat from immigration, from multiculturalism, from the refugee crisis. They have managed to argue that, other parties have neglected the identity politics of this. And those two things together, the social democratic language of criticizing globalization and of criticizing neoliberalism, mixed with the appeal to identity politics, is a winning formula. And it's one that's repeated in France, in Austria, in Germany, in the UK, and actually Donald Trump. I mean, if you listen to what Donald Trump actually says, like his actual speeches, he's criticizing globalization. He's criticizing the outsourcing of jobs to China. He's, criticizing the fact that workers have just lost out on capitalism and that the establishment, the left and the right establishment, has continued to pursue a neoliberal line since the 1990s. I'd say even that would be the main reason. If social democratic parties and parties of the left were able to recapture some of that language, I think they would be much more successful. But as it currently stands, social democratic parties are dying, and the populists are the ones who are reaping the rewards of this.
investigative journalism is making a comeback. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, you know, including with the mission of serving the public good. There are a lot of interesting things happening internationally. Just your thoughts on that. Thanks.
To jest zawsze
When we talk about the media, oftentimes we also hear the investigative journalist that quite simply was left out because there was not enough money for it, given the changes. The investigative journalism requires a certain amount of time and certain number of people to sit and research the archives and talk to people. And at the end, there might be no outcome. And that's the journalism. You, Romek, you spoke about that. Some of the journalism has moved towards books, and the reportage is more the area which has moved to books. There is no money for it. Very often it is now being funded also by NGOs or projects. I know a number of people that tell me it's the sort of job where you write half time, then you research, then you try and get the funding to make a trip and be able to write. And I think investigative journalism is also that area which is underinvested, and there's no money for it in the media. Perhaps some of these people can move towards writing books, but the investment outlay that's required, I'm not sure if it's even flourishing in Poland. I think that's quite the opposite. I think it's non-existent really, because there's no money for it. There's no time, there's no money, no one is willing to sustain these jobs. I'd add that foreign journalism is also part of this category. There's no money and no jobs for it.
Wracając do polskiego dziennika.
Back to Polish journalism, I worked for Gazeta Wyborcza for 6 years, since 1989, the largest opinion maker. The average circulation was 500,000 copies. It's about 100 at the moment. Saturday issue reached 800,000. And at the summit, at the peak of the title's success, there was a very small investigative team, and they wrote 2 texts, and that was it. And then it turned into a hobby that was pursued after hours. So first you had to grind your day texts, and only then could you write investigative pieces. Never ever has any investigative team been formally functioning in any of the leading Polish titles. Some journalists, some people wanted to, to do the right thing, and they did the right thing. No, there is the text about molesting boys in the Poznan choir, and lasted for decades, and it was everybody's secret. The church, the Catholic Church, was also covered, but they were short pieces. I remember after the first spotlight text, they wrote about 600 more texts, and you can see this in the film as well. It's totally impossible in Poland. 600 texts. There's no determination. There's no money. The titles want fewer journalists doing more for less money. And what we have seen, whatever investigative journalism we have seen, have been a handful of ambitious people who have spent years And obviously that could rest on the public media that are free from commercial race. When the public medium does not want advertisers' money, it can do things that advertisers don't like. But there's no such medium in Poland like that. Everyone is in the race for the money. I worked for a number of televisions. I was in charge of motoring shows. And there is Top Gear, BBC, watched by hundreds of millions of people in the world. It wasn't a neutral or objective. It was biased, it was vicious, it was nasty, but very witty, wasn't it? It talked about interesting things, not always true about cars. You know, it's common knowledge that British cars are best as opposed to German or Japanese. When journalists wanted to create shows on Polish television, when one of the journalists said something was wrong with the latch in the new Skoda, there was a call from a Skoda company next day informing that they've just moved their huge advertising budget to another title. So it's always about money, isn't it? At the end of the day, although we have seen a self-defense mechanism, there are these collectives of journalists who write whatever it takes. Either it'll be bought or not. If worst comes to worst, we'll write a book. We'll publish a book after several years. You know, some people have focused on one topic and one theme and they've written a book and well, they've succeeded, but it's totally out of the system, beyond the system.
But it seems to me like a lot of this journalistic energy is going into the reportage, and it must have something to do with the history of Polish journalism and how strong this Kapuczynski and followers school is and so on, because in other Eastern European countries that are equally poorer, you still have investigative journalism. Like maybe I come from Romania, and an investigation done by a sports newspaper now is completely revolutionizing the whole health system, cleaning up the whole health system. So it cannot be, lack of money cannot be the only explanation. There must be some, factors in how your media is organized here, but another time.
Well, to some extent, I want to follow up this point. There's 2 points I want to make. The first of all, if I may be so bold, I am hearing a lot of moaning and complaining, rather than actually thinking what we can do. And the point being that we have now seen potential business models where investigative teams are set up using foundations. We've also seen specialist groups of journalists getting together, finding a niche, and being able to create a service. Secondly, when you actually think about it, Google and Facebook create an enormous revenue stream from advertising. You would only need a very, very small proportion of that to come in the direction of journalism and journalistic outlets to make it profitable. So I would ask that perhaps some of the problem lies in us, because I write as well sometimes, in us. And I particularly refer here to the fact that we know, and I do want to be critical actually, I'm a member of the Socialist Journalists Association. And the journalists in Poland have allowed that organization to be taken over 100% by peace supporters. Now that tells me some of the problems that journalists in Poland have got. That you couldn't even keep control of your own association. It makes me angry because I get this stuff every day and I'm having to put up with this crap, from about peace and this, and it drives me mad, and I get very angry with you guys. You're all there saying, oh, how terrible it is, how bad it is, but you've allowed the main organization to fall away from you. And that illustrates this problem with the fact you're not prepared and not active in trying to develop new methods, new methodologies to create. We have to accept the world has changed. It has changed. It's life. You know, so I think some of the problems lies within us. And I use the collective term us.
In defense, I can say that the Polish Journalists Association, while it's taken over by right-wing, there have been some other movements like the Media Fund, Fundusz Mediów. So we are moaning and complaining, but in the new world, people who want to do media, however crazy that might be and however uncommercial this is, and will spend time discussing this rather than drinking beer out there. Now, people have decided to organize themselves. Like Alex said, the third sector, foundations, looking up to the audiences for support, and investigative journalism is often done like that. You start collecting fundraising using a number of platforms just to be able to sustain your writing about a topic. And if you don't have enough money to write about international affairs, you start collecting money here and there to talk about international affairs. So that's the more optimistic bit. 3 weeks ago, we were sitting in Berlin when I saw El Diario. It's incredible. It's a Spanish site with 40 people working day in, day out. You know, generated bottom up. It's an online daily, a true and honest medium with masses of people sitting away, committed to quality and committed to meaningful media. Moreover, they, excuse me, they are committed to cooperation, they are committed to exchange. I am a bit cynical about transnational platform, but when the chips are down, I do raise my hand in support. Even, yeah, we will do it. I'll translate this, and even if it reaches a very narrow audience, you know, my audience is not a mass audience, but in this humble but also honorable group, you should be writing, you should be sharing, and fortunately it's still visible. And you know, we are invited to other media to comment on international and domestic affairs, so you know, our voice is heard out there, so it does make sense, more or less. Sure, we would like things to be easier. We would like to see public media being public media. We would like to have public media in the first place. When we have to deal with tax returns in February, colleagues have this little competition who gets how many PIT, personal income tax declarations from the ad hoc employers. If you got 40 PIT, personal income tax declarations, that means you've written for 40 titles last year. So when I try to summarize this, what we've been talking about, things are not superb, but not bad either. The web is not an El Dorado, it's not a promise of El Dorado, but there are excellent people out there. So I recommend openDemocracy or Eurozy or zillions of other places. When when you read Ukrainian or Russian, Hromadske, it's a gem of a television broadcast from a flat in Kiev, and they launched along with Maidan. You know, probably you can never find another television channel where you could hear, when you can hear an interview with an artist or a politician going very deep into the topic for an hour or so. So it's so unmatched. So with that, I have one question. If revolution will not be televised, bringing it back to the title, where is the revolution going to be shown? How do we actually know there is a revolution?
Czy będzie rewolucja? To jest podstawowe pytanie. Też ta rozmowa o dziennikarzach zawsze jest o tyle trudna, że dziennikarze, tak jak politycy, jak posłowie i posłanki, są tacy sami jak społeczeństwo. Tak? Jak całe społeczeństwo podryfowało w prawicową stronę, to świat dziennikarski nie jest odmienny. Ja chyba nie chcę wchodzić w ten wątek ze Stowarzyszeniem Dziennikarzy Polskich, ale powiem tak, są grupy, które dostały dużo bardziej w tyłek w Polsce i o które należało zadbać niż o własny interes w pierwszej kolejności. Być może to jest też jakaś częściowa odpowiedź na to, dlaczego nie zadbali dziennikarze o SDP. Ale nie zadbali też o inne grupy, to jest inna historia. Tak? Więc ja myślę, że te opowieści o tym, że rewolucja gdzieś nie zostanie pokazana, one nie są prawdziwe. Tak? To znaczy, że niewątpliwie
True. The online has brought up a story that you can no longer hide things, you can no longer sweep it under the carpet, but having said that, you need to wrap it, you need to package it. But there's a new energy that is released, which is ecstatic, which is sudden, and which gives us much more information through the web. If we miss out on the revolution on TV, I wouldn't worry about that. I'm afraid the revolution is being slowly but surely hatched somewhere, you know, gaining more and more life. Like in Poland, I feel like we are in this period of political helplessness and quagmire. I would like to add that revolution will not be televised by tweeted, but the web is about quantity and who is louder, which is not always true, which is not always the valuable voice. And probably the right wing will be louder in Poland. I don't know.
Well, we have to ask ourselves, what does the revolution actually look like? I mean, the revolution today is not people, you know, attacking the Winter Palace. The revolution today is at a personal level. It's, you know, people identifying as transgender. That we now live in a world where there's more than two genders. It's, you know, people. It's gay marriage in Ireland. It's, you know, it's people themselves transforming their own selves, and through that way, they're transforming society. It's not any kind of big spectacle. In that sense, it won't be televised because there won't be anything really to televise. It's not cinematic. But it's also the fact that I think these people are actually doing the media for themselves. They are going onto social media. They are doing it. Many of the, you know, the campaign to elect Jeremy Corbyn in the UK was done predominantly on social media. Podemos started out of its own kind of TV show, La Tuerca. It's people who are moving away from this idea of the passive consumer model and going towards an active consumer model. And the democratization of media through social media is one thing helping that. In that sense, it's a very positive thing, and I can only be optimistic about it.
Dziękuję bardzo. Rzeczywiście
Thank you very much. I didn't think that there wouldn't be anything to film or to broadcast because it won't be worth it. But let's hope that the upcoming discussions will be leading to revolutions. Adam Zimmer and Kuczynski's book about the economy, that will be the topic tomorrow at 7. We'll be talking with Zandberg and Wielgus Piechnawiecki. Belief and Guilt with Marcy Shaw, Adam Michnik and Sławek Sierakowski, and on Thursday in Varecka 4 in the large room. Please go there because Neo-Nationalism at the Heart of Europe by Thomas Raffa. That's the exhibition with photos done by a Slovak photographer. And so you can appreciate the exhibition and hear a discussion about the ideology of national patriotism, and the meeting will be facilitated by Maciek Gnula with Łuczewski and Przegulska. So that's Thursday, and the rest you can find on the green flyers. Having said that, thank you very much, all the three of my panelists, Alex, Annabelle and Roman. Thank you.